So welcome back from the break, ladies and gentlemen. The theme of the second panel for today's conference is Looking In. This panel will consider the balance of priorities that we can and should have as a nation in 2065 and how we may want to assess our progress and success. The chairperson of this panel is Ms. Lee Xue-ying, Deputy News Editor of the Straits Times. And may I invite Ms. Lee to introduce this panel and the speakers.
Good morning, I'm Xue-ying. Many thanks to Janadas and IPS for inviting me here today. Well, Professor Tommy Cole lamented this morning that his panel comprised only of men, but took comfort from the observation that it's the oldest panel. So I hope you'll be happy to see that on this second panel here today, which is also the youngest, we have one woman. Amanda Chong is 28, a lawyer who is passionate about gender issues, and also a poet. So, Prof. Cole, please give us some time. I'm sure that within the next 50 years, we will have a panel of 3 wise women. So before coming to the conference today, I told a friend about some of the scenarios that we will be pondering. So one of the questions that our panel will be discussing is, what if Singapore fails to sustain itself as a vibrant, cosmopolitan global city? My friend's response was swift. He said, die law. But of course, there is more to the issue, and we will have 3 hyphenates to take us through this and other questions. Besides Amanda, we have another poet who also happens to be a public servant, Aaron Manian. We also have Jeremy Au, a social entrepreneur and a Harvard MBA student, who also happens to run a childcare business in Massachusetts. So a second question that they'll be looking at is, what if Singapore fails to become a creative and innovative nation? Again, the quick answer is obvious, die law. But the tougher question really is, how do we try to avoid such a destiny? How can we become a creative and innovative nation? This is a question that we have long been grappling with. In the year 2000, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said that it's time for a new burst of creativity in business. He said, I quote, "We need many new tries, many startups. Out of 10, maybe 1 will succeed and 8 will fail." 15 years later, we are still at it. DPM Tharman singled out our education system as key. He said that it needs to evolve to spur innovation and create a sense of individuality among Singaporeans. He said, I quote, "That spirit of individuality, that free play of the mind, isn't best developed in a system that is highly competitive and focused on tests." A last question for this panel is, what if non-economic indicators become the measure of a country's progress? It has become customary for our Prime Minister to use his New Year message to deliver the GDP growth for the year. What will happen if he uses, for instance, to deliver maybe the number of suicides that year in Singapore, or some kind of holistic happiness index? Jeremy, I know, has thought very carefully about this, and I will now invite him to offer his insights.
So, hello everyone, I'm Jeremy. So, some of you may know me for founding Conjunct Consulting that's helped over 100 charities and social enterprises with their strategic planning. Some of you may know me for pioneering pre-electoral polling with Quad.sg, where we explored how Singaporeans would vote and the social economic beliefs that drive that vote. And some of you may know me for setting up Cozy Kin at Harvard Business School, where I work with hundreds of parents to help raise their babies. Throughout these years, I've had the same fascination. What is progress? What is growth to the individual, to the family, to the community? Here is what I've learned. When we are with our children, we know what growth is. Growth is the difference between yesterday and today in their self-awareness and ability. We also know that our children are much more than their capacity to produce wealth or to consume it, although I must say they seem to do a lot of both. So yet, when we talk about Singapore as a nation, which encompasses millions of individual human beings, we somehow invert the model. We use gross domestic production and other economic metrics to measure our progress as a society and country. Growth in Singapore is commonly described as 1%. Negative 1%, not so good. 5%, excellent. Negative 5%, terrible. So why is it that this self-evident truth about human growth is somehow not put in practice for the community of 5 million human individuals in Singapore? And the answer is that GDP is easy, simple, clear. It is good for what it is designed to do, to measure production at a national level. It is an objective metric that all of us can agree on. What is produced in this country? You can use this metric to measure different points of time, 2006, 2010, 2016. It is simple to communicate to each other. $290 billion of production last year is good, and $300 billion of national production this year is even better. That is why it's so easy to use as a beacon for decision-making at a policy level, at a community level. And it is so easy to speak about, to show improvement and to show progress. Yet, GDP was never designed to measure societal progress. To some extent, we know that national production is correlated with individual wealth, which is in turn correlated with life satisfaction. Yet, we also know individually that Singapore is one of the world's most prosperous countries on a per capita basis. Yet, any Singaporean can also tell you that this doesn't mean that we feel happy, or that we feel prosperous, or that we feel that there is progress. Economic measures simply fail to capture the totality of what Singapore's progress means as a country, and whether people perceive that progress to have even taken place. So what does that mean? By measuring the entirety of Singapore's progress, we can then improve. And we already intuitively understand this as a society. We see this with our focus on global rankings for quality of life, labor markets, and economic conditions. Yet, these rankings are also inadequate because they only measure isolated facets of Singapore's progress, and it's always used in comparison against other countries. That is why across the world, leaders have always sought improved measurement of progress at the national level. And that ranges from the Human Development Index that's used globally to the Social Progress Index, which has come up more recently. And 3 years ago, Mr. Ho Kwon Ping spoke at 5 public IPS lectures on Singapore's future. And at the last lecture, I was there, and I was part of the audience, just like one of you, when he called for a uniquely Singaporean Human Development Index, which would measure our overall well-being. He noted that it had to be holistic, measurable, and aspirational for all Singaporeans. In fact, I actually stood up at that time, and I asked him a question. I said, what would go into this index? And he very politely laughed and answered that he would leave it to others to define the index. So it has been 3 years since then, and here is my answer. The first question is, where would we find a set of holistic values that all Singaporeans aspire to? What can we base this index and measurement upon? The answer is actually pretty simple, despite all the discussion about what it would encompass. We say it every day as kids. It is the national pledge. I proudly spoke the pledge every day as a schoolboy, and I remember, we, the citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves as one united people, regardless of race, language, or religion, to build a democratic society based on justice and equality so as to achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress for our nation. Simple words, powerful language. And yet, we leave it behind after our days as school children. Where do we use it today other than at our national events? And this is what we can base the index on, the core values within. We can base it on unity, racial harmony, democracy, justice, equality, happiness, prosperity, and progress. These are the values that we aspire to, and these are the values upon which the index can be based upon. So where would we find the metrics that are related to these values? How can we measure these values, and what does it mean for people in Singapore? Thankfully, we have the Gallup World Poll. It polls 100 issues across 160 countries every year, and is used by the United Nations and the World Bank for their research and reports. In Singapore, Gallup has conducted 1,100 face-to-face interviews annually since 2007, which leaves a margin of error of 3.8%. The questions that they ask is, what do Singaporeans think about Singapore? And this is what we can base this upon. So, it's time to review. So, in Singapore today, in 2016, for unity, 92% of Singaporeans felt that they could get support from others in society in times of need. And 93% felt respected in the recent times by others in society. For racial harmony, 87% believe that there is a high quality of life for minorities in Singapore. For democracy, 90% are confident that elections in Singapore are honest, and 97% believe that government is absent of corruption. For justice, 95% are confident in the police, and 89% are confident in the judicial system. And 96% believe that business is absent of corruption. For equality, 86% of Singaporeans believe that if you work hard, you can get ahead. And 86% believe they are free to choose what they want to do with their lives. For happiness, 60% are satisfied with their current life today, about where they could be. And 82% have recently felt positive feelings of joy and happiness in their lives. For prosperity, 88% are satisfied with their financial and economic standard of living in terms of what they can do and buy. Yet only 34% of Singaporeans believe that it is a good time for anyone to seek a job. And for progress, 69% are optimistic about their life in 5 years' time. And only 45% of Singaporeans believe that their financial living standards will improve in the next 1 year. And so overall, that means that Singapore gets about 80% on the Singapore Development Index. I personally like to think of it as a PSLE score of 240. So across time, what does that mean? It means that the Singapore Development Index has hovered between 70 to 80%, despite our annual year-on-year economic growth. Yet there is a much more interesting story about how Singaporeans perceive how we've progressed as a society relative to the values that we aspire to. For unity as a people, we have grown from 81 to 92%, with a strong dip in 2010 to 2011. For harmony, we've stayed high at 85% on average, with a dip in 2011. For belief that Singapore is a strong democratic nation, we weakened in 2011 and 2012 and have recently recovered since then. For justice, there was a similar weakening in 2011 and 2012, with a recovery since then. For equality of opportunity and life options, there was a slight dip in 2008, with it mostly being flat across these 10 years. Happiness itself took a strong dip in 2009 and 2011, and has stayed at roughly 71%. And what is also interesting is that the perceptions of how prosperous Singapore is as a country took a sharp dip in 2009, recovered strongly in 2010, and has then gradually slid by 3% every year till today. So people do not perceive that Singapore is as prosperous as it used to be, despite numbers of GDP and the like. And next, there is optimism about Singapore's future standard of living and life. And it shows a cyclical nature with dips in 2009, 2012, and 2016. What we can tell is that the data shows some interactions with key events, both external and internal. The 2008 financial crisis, which was felt between 2009 and 2011, the 2011 general election, as well as the 2016 general election, all seem to be interesting points that could account for changes in the national mood. Yet, by looking at how Singaporeans perceive our country's progress relative to our values, we then understand that Singapore's social fabric as a whole has strengthened over the years, and yet the belief and perception and the optimism about Singapore's economic vitality has dropped over time. And so, what does that mean for us? The Singapore Development Index can thus form the framework for future discussions of all issues in Singapore. For government policy proposals, we can use it to score and communicate the likely impact of these programs and policies on our core values. We can use the Singapore Development Index as the new beacon for discussion and measurement and tracking. And last but not least, this set of measured values is not just a common language to very academics and policymakers. It is a way to involve community stakeholders and our social sector leaders and our business leaders in a way that can help in every facet of what it means for Singapore to grow. In conclusion, with our children, we know that they are not perfect. Through their imperfection, we see how much they have truly grown, as well as how to truly unlock their potential. With Singapore too, we know also that our country is not perfect. Yet, by bravely seeing our imperfections, we too can see how much we have actually grown as a nation over the years, as well as unleash the extraordinary potential within. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that very interesting look. I would now like to invite Aaron to give his presentation. I first knew of Aaron in 1997 when he was the winner of the Angus Ross Prize for that year. Since then, he has reached only ever higher heights. He published his first book of poems in 2005, and he has a new book out this year, and you heard it here first. Please go and get it. All right, Aaron, please.
Xueying, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you also to the team at IPS for this invitation. The question I was asked to ponder, not necessarily answer, but to ponder was, what if Singapore fails to be a creative and innovative nation? And these days we live in an age of participation, right? So I thought I would start with some audience participation. So if anybody thought you could get away with completely passive listening, you probably won't, at least not for this bit. And I'd just like you to think a bit about this. What is common in all of these sentences? If anyone feels they want to shout something out, just feel free to either go up to a mic or shout it out. I think the audience might be able to hear you. Anyone want to venture a guess? A very reticent audience today. Anyone at all? Punctuation at the end of the sentence. Very nice. Yes. Very true, but not what I was looking for. Pardon? Passivity. Debatable, I suspect, Gillian, but yeah, except the second one, right? Otherwise, a lot of passivity, but also not what I was looking for. Anyone else? All cliches. True, but not what I was looking for as well. Yes. Things teenagers would say to their parents. Do they really say children blossom into adults? I'm not so sure. But nice try. Anger. Not quite. One last one. Pardon? Very definite. That's true. They're all declarative sentences, but not quite. Let me give you a clue. What's interesting about the underlined words? They're not all verbs. They're not all single words. Just to get, away from the obvious. Anyone? I hear laughter, but not quite anything else. No, not quite. Okay, this is good. It means that the trick works, The thing that's interesting about all of those words is that they all reflect some kind of metaphor. If we go back to that, right? Children blossom, they are somehow like plants or flowers. I will defeat his argument. There is an image of war there. I don't have room for this in my life, as if life is a space. Life has cheated me because it's a game and there are rules and it has somehow flouted those rules. Scarcity has given birth, as if scarcity is a person, right? And metaphors matter. They're all over the place. Sometimes they can be a lot more subtle. You know, we wake up, but we fall asleep. I can't get an idea across to someone. A message is buried deep in dense prose. If you think about the previous panel, right, Prof. Wang told us that nation states must contain primordial identities, as if states are a space. Cho had wonderful metaphors, right? Oceans, mountains, heartlands, edges. Joe talked about miscalculated escalation, as if the relationship between states is partly mathematically determined. The examples here, again, right, we don't cover ground. We can examine ideas more deeply, as if they are somehow characterized by depth. And again, I don't have room to deal with this right now, right? Life as a space. Metaphors are everywhere. And I date myself slightly with this slide, but, you know, like dead people in Sixth Sense, they really are all over the place. And this is how I wanted to answer these questions. I wanted to examine what exactly our metaphors and images for creativity and innovation are. Because that, I think, will help us answer the question why we might not become a creative and innovative nation, as well as hopefully point us to some possible solutions if we can come up with better metaphors. Because one issue that I think we've always faced is that we've tended to treat creativity as an engineering process. The metaphors are primarily engineered. We talk about having a structure for creativity, right? Of putting in place institutions, of having input and output with some kind of intermediate process. All those are metaphors that reflect an engineering mindset. Nothing wrong with an engineering mindset, of course. But it alone, I think, cannot answer everything about creativity, because what it doesn't capture for us is how dynamic and alive and potentially non-linear a creative process actually is. Engineering, in its most extreme form, can actually be fairly linear and stable and predictable, all of which are valuable things, but don't capture the complexity of creativity. We've also tended to think of creativity as primarily market-driven. And what I mean by that is when we talk about incentives for creativity, right, of measuring the costs and benefits of having a creative society, or when we talk about the costs and benefits of a system to address creativity, when we talk about making it in a child's interest to become creative in schools, all of those are primarily market-driven metaphors. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, because some things are useful when they are given incentives and when we analyze the costs and benefits. But I think something is missing there as well, because what the market doesn't capture is how spontaneous creativity can be, and how innovation sometimes involves dealing with things that have worth, but don't necessarily have quantifiable value. Engineering, when taken to an extreme, can lead us to what I like to call a scientific Sahara, right? A form of trying to encourage creativity that is actually quite dry, very arid, and soulless. And if we take the market to its logical conclusion, then we have a problem as well, because creativity then becomes only about what can be sold, what can be bought, what can be commodified, rather than about some kind of larger creative process. So what do I suggest instead? Right, I think we need to have better metaphors. And at this stage, I wanted to share a story with you about a book that a friend of mine put together sometime over last year. It's called The Birthday Book, and Malminda, the editor, is actually in the audience somewhere. I will not embarrass him by asking him to stand up. But The Birthday Book was an interesting experiment because it involved asking 51 writers to contribute views about Singapore's future. And the question they all were asked was, what is Singapore's next big thing? Interesting because we asked people from a whole range of views, you know, from different sectors and backgrounds, and Mal told everyone, write what you care about. There was no honorarium, so there was nothing market-driven about this. And of the people who said yes, eventually, of course, 51 said they would write, but only 4 people said no. right? People who were busy finishing up a PhD or had other commitments like having books they had written and they had to launch. And it was very telling for me that despite the lack of any clear structure, right, we didn't tell anybody what to write. We just said, write about whatever you care about. So this was not an engineered process. And there was nothing really in it for everyone in terms of pure market incentives. And yet 51 people said they would do it. I'm curious about why, because I think there's something there that we can understand about the creative and innovative process. Often we stereotype creativity as being about some kind of loose carnival, a very, very indulgent process where everything is fun. And carnivals, of course, have very dark sides. They have a performative element that can sometimes be quite artificial. And I think that's not what we were talking about when we put the birthday book together, and it's not what kind of metaphor we need when we go into the future. What I think is we need something even better than that. Better than the market, better than engineering alone, better than carnivals. And I'm going to suggest two ideas to all of you. The first is the idea of the metaphors of biology. Because biological and ecological systems are constantly alive and dynamic. The futurist Bob Johansen, who works at the Institute for the Future, once said that a key trait of leadership in the future will be what he calls bioempathy. The ability to understand how some of the rhythms of the lives we face are actually from biological systems. Now, what's so interesting about biological systems? First of all, they are constantly evolving. They're always works in progress. Prof. Wang, you mentioned in your presentation earlier that we are always in progress, right? Nations are always working themselves into being. That's the image of a biological system, right? A system that is in permanent beta, always evolving and never stopping. That, I think, is very important in a creative system because we need to allow for that adaptability and aliveness to actually be captured. Another reason that bioempathy is useful is that biological time is much longer than most of the timescales we are used to. Things happen in a biological system over long periods. And creativity and innovation, I think, will actually take a certain amount of time. They take time to evolve and to grow and to eventually blossom. Finally, the biological metaphor is powerful for me because it captures the fact that creativity has both monumental and mundane aspects. The monumental stuff we all know, right? The things that created the Sistine Chapel or Leonardo da Vinci's great works of art. But creativity has other aspects to it as well. Small, daily aspects that are constantly evolving. The kind of creativity that tells Singaporeans we need to use our land more effectively. That creates new industrial estates in Jurong or new towns in places like Punggol. Those are creativity and innovation at work as well. But without the sexiness, without the pomp and circumstance that is always or traditionally applied to some aspects of the creative process. So biology, I think, is one important way in which we can approach creativity and innovation in a more nuanced manner. But there's another metaphor as well that I think is very powerful, and that's captured on this slide, the idea of gifts rather than exchange. Now, gifts are really interesting things, right? Because in their pure form, gifts are often intangible. They might have value to us, but they don't always have quantifiable worth. The teddy bear that someone gave you when you were young, or the gift of being able to write poetry, to paint, to produce sculpture, to be an innovative media person or journalist or teacher. Those are not things we can easily quantify. Gifts are often not something that we deserve. That's the whole idea of a gift, right? If someone says, I am gifted, they cannot really claim credit for it because they either had it or didn't. But a gift is not proprietary. It's not something to which we are always entitled. You also can't plan gifts. You can't tell yourself, I want to become a better writer tomorrow, or I want to acquire a certain gift. You can have a discipline and a practice that allows you to build up the talent, but you may not always be able to structure it in a neat, stable, and predictable way. So I think that captures something for us about how we can approach creativity if we treat it as a gift rather than as a purely engineered system. And the fourth thing I wanted to mention about gifts is that they are at their best when they are used to pay things forward. None of us can really claim to be owners of our gifts because they're given to us by some larger unseen force. The Greeks called those the muses. These days we call it inspiration. But gifts come from somewhere that is intangible, that is out there in the ether, that we don't always we're not always able to at least pin down. And we're therefore stewards rather than owners of the gifts that we have. Gifts then have momentum rather than consumption, and they need to be understood in that way. Because creativity and innovation, if we try to overplan them, I think, will start making us treat it too much as something we can own, rather than as something over which we have a trust, and which we may eventually have to give up for the betterment of a society. So I wanted to end with this observation, which is the fact that metaphors are very useful. They are everywhere, and they can magnify certain aspects of things. An engineering metaphor magnifies the systemic interactions amongst the different components. The market metaphor magnifies aspects like incentives and costs and benefits. But they also downplay certain things. They can mask things, and they therefore can have an obfuscating effect on the kinds of policies and systems that we put in place. And in the spirit of the birthday book, as well as other ways of operating, what I think we need is better metaphors that bring in the images of ecology and images of gifts as well, if we are to understand the creative and innovative process in a more sophisticated way. We need overlapping and multiple metaphors. What you see on this slide is three-sided figures created by computer-generated interfaces, and they are overlapping with each other in dynamic, interesting, and generative ways. That, I think, is the kind of system or ecosystem for creativity that we will need in the future. I thought I'd end with these great lines from T.S. Eliot, some of my favorites from English poetry, when he talks about how we will not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring is to return where we started and know the place for the first time. What I think Eliot was getting at when he talks about knowing the place for the first time, and that's why I underlined the words here, is the fact that we will know the place when we see it through new eyes. And the new eyes, the new lenses that we need will come when our metaphors change and evolve and hopefully become more rich and overlapping. Same with creativity, and the same with how we define ourselves as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I think I can speak for the audience when I say that we were held captive by your presentation. That's my metaphor for this presentation. Next up is Amanda. Amanda is also a poet, and she also has a book out this year. So this is not meant to be some kind of book hawking session, but just to share with you the many talents of our speakers today. Amanda also ran a literacy program for low-income residents in Chinatown. So she's also a poet with a conscience and a soul. So Amanda, please.
Good afternoon. The question that I was asked to grapple with today was, what if Singapore fails to sustain itself as a vibrant global cosmopolitan city? Since the founding of Singapore in 1819, Singapore's existence has been predicated on how attractive we are to the rest of the world. In 1819, it was our deep and sheltered harbour, our location at the crossroads of India and China in the zigzag of different trade routes. We drew immigrants from different countries and became a bustling port. Post-independence, as we forged our own destiny, our attractiveness to the world became even more paramount. In 1972, it was declared that Singapore's very survival rested on our ability to become a global city with the world as our hinterland. Singapore had to position itself as a haven to MNCs and foreign investors, and our tools of seduction were political stability, law and order, and a clean government. In the 1990s, as we strove to shift our economy away from labor-intensive industries, it became clear that Singapore didn't just have to attract corporations. We had to be attractive to people too, the right sort of people, global talent, the creative class, the class of knowledge workers who bring economic growth to the cities that they settle in. As Prime Minister Goh said in 1999, we must make Singapore an oasis of talent. Many cities are vying to be key global nodes in the region. Who wins depends on who attracts the most talent and forms a critical mass that draws in still more entrepreneurs, bankers, artists, writers, and professionals. The creative class values diverse artistic lifestyle experiences. We were going to provide them with that. A 1991 government report titled The Next Lap set the agenda. In order to attract global talent, we must begin to nurture Singapore's creative and cultural sectors. This was never a priority in the earlier stages of our development. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew famously proclaimed that poetry was a luxury we could not afford. It was no secret that the economic imperative was the government's key driving force in cultivating the arts. As PM Goh put it in 1999, artistic creativity is an important element of a knowledge-based economy. There will be more funds to promote the arts. As we unpick this narrative, it becomes apparent that the vision of Singapore as a vibrant, global, cosmopolitan city is a vision built from the outside in. It is a branding exercise grounded in the desire to transform ourselves so we might be attractive to the world. This vision has brought us many of the trappings of a cosmopolitan global city, and indeed, the international reputation of being one. We host glittering events like the Formula One and Art Stage. We have built beautiful museums, and our government spending in the arts and cultural sector is $700 million per year. As a result of these efforts and more, Singapore has been ranked as the best place in the world to live in for expatriates, exactly what we had hoped to achieve. So when I think of Singapore in 2065, I'm not worried that we will close our doors to the world and fail to sustain ourselves as a global cosmopolitan city. We are far too pragmatic for that. What I am concerned about is that if we continue in this trajectory of pursuing a global city built from the outside in, while we may be opening our doors wide to the world, we are ultimately closing the doors on ourselves. As a poet and a member of the Singapore arts community, I want to focus on why, beyond attracting global talent, Singapore's art scene is important for our own sake. The argument I want to advance is that the arts should not, or even primarily be, just an instrument of the state to attract global talent. Instead of being a mere feature of the outside-in vision of Singapore as a global city, the arts can be an important part of Singapore's transformation into a mature and self-confident nation. In other words, the arts can be a vital way of constructing Singapore as a global city from the inside out. I propose 3 ways in which I believe that a more prominent role for the arts will help us to achieve this. First, the arts helps individuals come to grips with an increasingly complex world. The world we live in today is highly polarized. We see this on our Facebook news feeds, which have turned into echo chambers. The internet allows us to retreat into our own silos, interacting only with like-minded people who amplify our biases and reading only content that reinscribes our worldviews. Ultimately, we begin to feel no real need to engage with anyone with differing views. This impoverishes our national conversation. Living in silos is intellectually easy. Reducing, simplifying, and flattening allows us to preserve the instantaneous quality of our opinions. It saves us from the difficult but important work of consideration. To be sure, many areas of human endeavor necessarily operate by simplifying and reducing. For example, the project of governance has to be reductionist to a certain degree. Singapore's own governance relies on categorization, first along the lines of race, the famous CMIO model, along the lines of religion, education, and income. Categorization is an indispensable tool in identifying problems and making policies. But when categorization entails oversimplification, especially of people, we must be mindful of the subtleties that are lost. Art can help us to develop that mindfulness, because art, or at least good art, does not traffic in reductionism. The arts, when unfettered by censorship, can give us the opportunity to engage with all shades of society and alternative views of life. Art can force us out of silos, open up possibilities, and challenge us to consider a more complex version of the truth. The stage, novel, and film are spaces in which we hear opinions from other than our own tribe. In his novel, The Last Lesson of Mrs. D'Souza, Cyril Wong tells the story of a conservative schoolteacher who, compelled by a sense of moral responsibility, outs a gay boy to his own father, resulting in devastating consequences. Wong's narrative is rich with ambivalence, forcing the reader to grapple with a complex issue. Today, however, there is a sentiment among the arts community that the state only supports art which it deems useful for its instrumentalist goal. Singapore artists feel that only art that steers clear of controversy is wholly embraced by the state. Works by Singapore artists which have advanced unorthodox political narratives have been censored or have had their funding withdrawn. The graphic novel, The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai by Sunny Liu is a famous example. In his book, Liu critically examines our political legacy and at one point advances a counterfactual history of Lim Chin Siong as Singapore's first Prime Minister. His National Arts Council funding was pulled just a day before the book's launch. Still, his book went on to achieve critical acclaim, even making the New York Times bestsellers list, an unprecedented achievement that ought to have been the cause of national celebration. In order for art to perform the function of forcing us out of our silos, we cannot embrace art only that entertains. We need art that challenges us. Such art can force us to see, hear, and think differently, and ultimately decide for ourselves if we want to act differently. Such an openness of mind allows us to be poised to listen to each other, so we may arrive at a more enriched version of the truth. Surely this is a hallmark of a mature society. Second, I believe that art has an important role to play in Singapore because it enables us to recognize our equal humanity. Former US President Obama alluded to this when he talked about how literature was essential to him in keeping his focus on governance rather than politics. He said, "Fiction was useful as a reminder of the truths under the surface of what we argue about every day and as a way of seeing and hearing the voices, the multitudes of this country." Art forces us into a place of receptivity as we enlarge our universes and inhabit the lives of people of different genders, races, religions, and political views. Art gives us a way of listening to voices which are not part of our daily lives. We're no longer cloistered in our narrow worlds, but are drawn out of ignorance into a place of empathy. Harish Sharma's play Off Center opened up Singaporeans' eyes to the struggles of those with mental illness back in 1993, when going to Woodbridge Hospital was still a rude playground child. More recently, some Singaporeans have angrily refused to have foreign workers' dormitories in their own neighborhoods, fearful that workers would soil their parks and cause public disturbances. Singapore's Ethos Books has published English translations of the poetry of Bangladeshi construction worker Muhammad Mokul Hussain. Mokul began scribbling poetry on cement bags at his construction site. His poetry challenges our close-minded stereotypes and reminds us that we all share a universal longing for home. He says, "Me, migrant, live overseas, thousand miles away. Me, migrant, live outdoors, outside from you." Apart from giving us the opportunity to listen to the voices of others, the arts also enables us to see people as agents with layered motivations who make meaningful choices based on their own values and expectations. This sense of empathy can inform the way that we think about a myriad of topics, including public policy. As policymakers, we become less tempted to think of marginalized groups as objects to be acted upon or problems to be solved, but rather a recognition of agency compels us to focus on building capacity and diminishing vulnerability in individuals. Instead of thinking about how we can prescribe values, we can focus on how we empower individual decision-making. This can transform the way we think about policies to help those living in poverty, for example. Thirdly, and finally, the arts is important as a means of pondering new directions in the Singapore story. The writer Gwee Lee Swee says, "The central question Singapore is facing now, in the middle of the 2010s, is a crisis of story. It is a problem of what comes next, what kind of future to anticipate, now that the declared goals of stability, prosperity, and recognition are reached. The plight is a long time coming." The neatly defined arc of the Singapore story, a sleepy fishing village transforming from third world to first in a single generation, has long been completed. What narrative is there to replace it as we travel towards 2065? Conversations about what we value as a nation are now of utmost importance, and so is questioning the course that our country is on. These conversations may take place in conferences like this one, but they can also powerfully take place in the arts. We must be prepared for a multiplicity of voices to join in this conversation. What is good for our country cannot just be determined by politicians and policymakers. It has to be determined by the people too. And the arts can be a valuable means for people to make sense of this question and to pose their own answers to it. The arts is a realm in which an individual can inspect her inner world and a society can interrogate its own identity. This is the inherent value of culture. In every civilized society, it has long been the job of artists to ask difficult questions and for those in power to listen. There may be uneasy truths that we need to hear or dissenting voices that demand our consideration. One of the most notable voices is the poet Alfian Sa'd. In his passionate poem, "Singapore, You Are Not My Country," he says, "How can you call yourself a country, you terrible hallucination of highways and cranes and condominiums 10 minutes drive from the MRT?" We need look no further than the same poem to understand that dissent comes from a place of love, from an artist's sensitivity and concern for justice. While his poem may appear to be a litany of accusations leveled at Singapore, Alfian ends the poem with this plaintive cry, which belies both the sense of dislocation and frustration at the limits of our historical consciousness. He says, "I have lost a country to images. It is as simple as that. Singapore, you have a name on a map, but no maps to your name. This will not do. We must stand aside and let the lion crash through a madness of symbols back to that dark jungle heart, when eyes were still embers waiting for a crownless prince of Palembang." The surging popularity of Singapore poetry shows us that the arts are gaining special resonance in resolving our crisis of story. For the past year, every April, over 3,000 Singaporeans have gathered online to write a poem a day as part of the Singapore Poetry Writing Month, or Singpo Remo. This group includes schoolboys, aunties, and office workers. They're writing not just in English, but in inventive forms that sometimes even meld our 4 official languages. The arts is a critical space in which our collective thoughts about Singapore are renewed. It is a way that society reiterates the ideals that are precious to us and protests the ones which need to be remade. As Singapore moves on from the project of survival to the project of building a legacy, the arts is a crucial way of visioning the country as we yearn it to be, of building a global city from the inside out. It is a way for us as Singaporeans to elevate our spirit and engage more deeply with the people around us. It is also a powerful indicator of how far we have come as a country. This is the vision of a vibrant city we should sustain into 2065. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. So now we have our 3 speakers who have completed their presentations. We will now open the floor to questions, but before I do that, I do have one question for the speakers myself. So I think what's interesting about the 3 questions that IPS had asked us to ponder is the assumption that they come with. So there's an assumption that we do want to become a vibrant, cosmopolitan global city. We assume that we all want that. We also assume that we all want to be creative and innovative. But as Janadas reminded us this morning, we are a city which is also a country. We have no country beyond this city. So there may be Singaporeans who want maybe a slower pace of life. They want more familiarity. They don't want maybe immigrants. And they have nowhere else to go to for that. Maybe they will go to, the most they can go to is Pulau Ubin. Or there's no hinterland for them. So given that, how do we ensure that we have, we all have reached a consensus that these are desirable goals that we want to reach by 2065. Maybe Aaron or Amanda would like to give this a try?
Yeah, just to make sure it's on. I'm happy to take a stab at it. I do think that at a macro level, it is important, at least for my question, that some of us are creative and innovative. Because one of the things I thought Janadas alluded to in the morning was that in order to be a thriving global city, one that is attractive to talent and can attract ideas and also potentially be a source of ideas and solutions for the world, that means that a certain amount of creativity and innovation must happen, and we must be seen as welcoming to creativity and innovation. Does that mean that every single person needs to be creative? I think here I will go back to what I said earlier, that creativity has a huge spectrum, and that there are some things which are monumental examples of creativity, and others which are much more mundane examples of creativity. And we need all of those things to coexist, right? The simple acts of creativity, of doing things in new ways, of becoming more productive, of finding ways to not just cut costs, but change your business models if you're an SME. That, for me, is an example of creativity and innovation at work as well. And I do think it's important that on aggregate, we have enough of a critical mass in Singapore that is endeavoring to push those boundaries.
I think that, as I've outlined in my speech, given our nature as a country and the state of our economy, it isn't really tenable for us to close our doors to the world. So when I addressed the question, for me, it became more about what is this vision of Singapore as a global cosmopolitan city, to whom is it directed at? And for me, it was just very important that as we continue traveling in this trajectory, there's a bit more introspection of what this global cosmopolitan city means to us as Singaporeans and how it actually contributes to enriching and maturing us as a society and as a nation. I think this kind of question is even more important to be introspective about, especially now when we see a lot of Western democracies turning insular. And I think Singapore has to go through that process of interrogating why it is important for us to be a global city and what kind of sacrifices that entails.
Jeremy, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. The fact is, for Singapore to be creative doesn't mean that every individual has to be creative. I think that what it means is that every individual has to reach their full potential in whatever domain or industry or skill set they wish to pursue. And I think what this speaks about is that for Singapore to be creative, it means that the creative class, the people who are in the creative related industries also need to become so. And so what we have to understand is, what does it mean for Singapore to be defined inside out by the values that we aspire to? And what does that mean to every single demographic or segment or group of people, the creatives, the industrialists, the people who are consultants? These values mean different things to them. And as a result, it doesn't mean that in order for Singapore to be a creative country, it means that it excludes other things. But at the same point of time, we cannot be all things at once.
Any questions? Yes, this one here. Okay, and one there.
Thank you, Sui. Zainal here from MFA. I have a question about culture, creativity, and our future. But before that, allow me to say that I'm so impressed and reassured by the young panelists. When I was their age, I was busy looking after free milk program, UNICEF free milk, to help to ensure that my colleagues in class had breakfast in school. But look at them now, talking about technology, talking about art, creativity, and our future. So my question is, if I may draw on the example drawn by Aaron about the Sahara being soulless, but if you were to say that to an Arab, they'll get offended. I'm a special envoy to the Middle East, I'm very sensitive about it. But the question is, how do you look to the future when you relate to China? We are being cosmopolitan, multicultural, multi-religious. Do we look at the 4,000 years of Chinese history? Or do we look at how China look at South China Sea? Do we look at the Arabs differently? if we want to take advantage of the opportunities there? Or do we look to our closer neighbors and the insecurity, not so much about Malay dominance, but the sense of insecurity and how they see the world and their own internal problems? How do you relate to them? And how do we make sure that we continue to be relevant, the mantra of our founding Prime Minister and leaders? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call on two more. I saw one hand up there. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Paul Tambaya from the National University of Singapore. My question is actually directed at the first speaker, and I was curious that on the one hand, you cited the pledge as a simple aspiration for all Singaporeans, although I know certain individuals have described those as highfalutin aspirations. But on the other hand, the bulk of your presentation was focused on an opinion poll. I'm just curious as to whether you think we could use the pledge as perhaps a benchmark, and we could assess Singapore's progress as to how far we're going towards the goals of the pledge. Like, for example, whether we could reach the stage where children of all races and languages could have access to the best schools in Singapore, or maybe even one day we have a non-Chinese Prime Minister. Thank you.
Hi, can I be next? I'm over here.
Yes, okay, hi.
Hi, my name's Jean. I am obsessed with what Prof. Koh said about the angry voter. So I have a what-if question to the three panelists. The what-if question is, what if the entire ballroom here were not filled with global elites or even national elites? What if the entire ballroom was filled with angry voters? How would you change what you just said? How would you present it differently? What would you say to them? Thank you.
That's a great what-if question. Okay. Anyone who wants to start, Aaron?
Sure, I can take a stab at two of those at least. It's a tough audience and great questions as well. Okay, first of all, let me take Mr. Zainul's questions, because there were quite a few questions there, actually. I'm very glad I said what I said about metaphors, both magnifying certain things and having masks, or masking effect on something, because I fully agree that the desert metaphor can be much richer than the way I painted it, and it certainly is one that if I wanted to flesh things out a lot more, I would include the unseen aspects of life that can take place in the desert. But I don't think that was your main question. You also had a much larger question about how do we engage with countries that have much longer civilizational paths, right, deep histories, and how do we engage with them in the kinds of processes that we are trying to use in the survival that we take now, as well as the longer-term process of success, right? I would think it actually has to be quite issue-specific. I think if we try and have a simple one-size-fits-all solution to say all of what we do with China, or all of what we do with the Middle East, or even our neighbors, then we will be kind of involved in an exercise in futility, because there cannot be any kind of totalizing narrative or answer in what we do. I would think it has to be quite issue-specific. On tech cooperation, for instance, sorry, the letter P is always a very dangerous one when you're on a panel. But on tech cooperation, I would think that we would have a lot more common language amongst different technopreneurs and people who are interested in finding out how they can push the boundaries of technological evolution. And so on that front, I would think actually perhaps less of the history is critical. We would be focusing a lot more on a forward-looking sort of approach and thinking about where we can go together as a global community of technological innovators. On something like educational cooperation, for instance, I think there we might have to look much more at cultural aspects, because we want to take into account the fact that China has a huge amount of both continuity and change in what they've gone through. The Middle East, for instance, is itself a gross aggregation, and there are actually so many ways we can unpack what that region is about and identify richnesses amongst the different nation states and the different tribes that exist there, the two of which do not always coincide. So I think we have to look at what exactly the issue is and be quite nuanced in taking an issue-specific approach to those different approaches. Yeah.
Jeremy, do you want to go?
Sure. So for the question about the gap between ideals and opinion polls and the like, I think the question that we asked ourselves was really kind of saying, what is a truer and deeper understanding of Singapore as a nation? And so the question that I sought to answer was what it would look like at the national level. And yet there's also a large amount of truth where you said that there are deeper issues with people are feeling that specifically what does that mean in terms of policies? What does it mean for our group of people, our tribe? And in this case, I will bring in some other experience where in Quad.sg, where we did the electoral polling beforehand. And what we understood was that there was a strong correlation between issues about how meritocratic Singapore is highly correlated with beliefs about immigration, openness, and other issues. And so when we actually look at the scores and say, look, it's 80%, actually the last 20% is what I would consider a forgotten group of people. And I think that is why this index is so hard to budge, is because when we look at this index and say, look, I want to work on this on a national level, it's easy to kind of like optimize for the easiest solution for the 80%. But if you really measure this and say, what does it take for the final 20% to get to that 100%, I think you start to understand there are a lot more directed and targeted and smaller scale policies that have to happen in order for that to actually substantially improve. And so for those policies that you mentioned about the belief that minorities are integrated at all levels of governance, that children have an access to a bright future, all of those things are true and are in fact will be made more powerful when we think about the index as something that helps measure how this will help improve the national optimism and forward-lookingness of Singaporeans. I think I also want to address the second question, which is what if the hall was filled with angry voters? And I think it's a great question. And the question is what I would say. And I think for me the answer is I would listen. I would ask them, what do these values mean to you today? And after hearing them out from each and every one of them, I would ask, how can we help? Because the truth is, we're in this together. No individual is an island. We are all in this together. These values are aspirational for all. And helping one is helping another, and helping the group is also helping the individual. And so if this hall was filled with people, brothers, sisters, neighbors, community members, the people we see in the street, and the people that we have fun with, I think the most important thing for us, as you've already said, the lead, is to listen genuinely and sincerely to what they have to say. Because if not, there is not much of a road ahead.
I think I will address Jean's question as well. I thought it was a very valuable question, and it demands a lot of introspection. And in fact, it was one of the questions that I thought about a lot when crafting this speech. I think for me, as a poet, part of the young cosmopolitan global elite, it's very easy to be aware of that and to realize that it seems as if that I'm completely inhabiting a different world. As Sheng alluded to, I run a literacy program in a low-income neighborhood, and I've been running it for the past 4 years. So every weekend, I teach migrant women or low-income children how to read. And to me, I have a huge burden for social justice and social equality in Singapore. And when I look at my two passions, I want them to have some unity. I want them, I don't want them to occupy entirely separate spheres. And so I have been doing a lot of thinking about how the arts are relevant to every Singaporean. And I think at the end of it, what I thought was that the 3 points that I highlighted, number one, that arts helps us to make sense of a complex world. Number two, that art helps us to build empathy. And that three, art helps us to forge a new way forward in new directions in the Singapore story. These are equally applicable to Singaporeans across all income groups. And personally, I've had the experience of teaching poetry to foreign domestic workers in the context of workshops, and to just see how empowering that is to them, and even to children who are from lower income backgrounds. And I think generally when we think about the arts as a country, we need to stop the stereotype of thinking that it is just a preoccupation of the elites. I think it can be a very powerful way of forging a sense of human commonality amongst everyone. And I think if we look at examples in other countries and how they've used dance, music, writing as a tool of kind of understanding people from different social spheres and then we have something to learn from that. And I think the efforts from our museums and from the National Arts Council, there have been several efforts that target the misconception that the arts is just for the elites.
I just wanted to jump in on Jean's question as well. And Jean is a dear friend. I was not ignoring your question. I just wanted to make sure that we get other voices in as well. But I think the angry voter question is an important one. And I would personally feel quite torn, to be honest, in terms of what to say. And I would want to, first of all, even as I listen, as Jeremy pointed out, and try and use ways that we hear the stories that are out there, I would also want to be very clear that the interests of the angry voter should not be treated in the same way as some of the candidates they have chosen to represent them. Because the thing I'm torn about is there are legitimate stories out there of marginalization and deprivation which we must address, both as a country and as a global system. But that doesn't mean that bullying and lying and general bad behavior should be condoned. And I think one of the dangers we face now is if we conflate the behavior of some of the candidates out there with the interests that underlie them, we conflate them too much, and we risk over-romanticizing what's going on here. So yes, by all means, I would listen, but I would be quite careful in how I then approach these two different aspects. I would also ask people what metaphor they want to choose for their lives. Are they going to choose to be victims or agents? And I realize that may be itself a fairly romantic image to have, but I think it's important because if we choose to be victims, then we will always be victims, and we will never have any kind of agency in trying to take control over the future. And that's one of the dangers, I think, that we see in some of the political system's current potential trajectories.
All right, one question there.
Thank you. So following what Aaron was saying, I think it's so important then we have this sense of creativity to think out of the box. That creativity is not just about enhancing our SME or innovation, but to be able to solve our problems. And this is perhaps how Amanda brings in the sphere of arts. What I would like to share is that being a parent of 2 children who have gone to School of the Arts, it is a concern that there isn't enough emphasis to incentivize these kids to go into arts beyond the art school. In fact, sometimes we wonder if this is School of the Arts or school with some arts, as it's becoming, academic emphasis is still so strong. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's not proportionate. Leading from this morning's discussion and to looking in, do we have a sense of the difference between the patriotism and nationalism? Because nationalism is what has driven UK to come out of Brexit, going to Brexit, and US voting for a man who wants to look inwards. And national service is supposed to help our young men become more patriotic. And I wonder if that's really working, because recently talking to some young men who is in national service, they don't feel more patriotic. Is that something that we are reviewing? Because I'm very concerned if we're spending tax dollars and 2 years of the lives of these young men, and they are not becoming patriotic. And how do we as a nation as well have people who feel more attached to this country? And it's hard when you have so many historical buildings being taken down. So I'd like to raise this as discussion. Even something as simple as Dakota area of where these old HDBs are being brought down for progress. So is that what progress is going to mean? And is that the progress that we keep wanting, where people are going to feel that this is never a country we recognize? Thank you.
I think there are at least 3 questions there. Anyone else who wants to ask a question now?
Oh, well, sorry, me again. But I just want to piggyback on the last question and ask the panelists, who are all great and young. But, all this talk about creativity, vibrancy, innovation, I sort of feel that you have not given any, at least overt, acknowledgement to heritage and the importance of our own history and heritage. You can't be creative in a vacuum. And I fear that all this talk about innovation means throwing out the old and bringing in the new. Okay, excuse me, just allow me one example. Mandai in Singapore, there's this big talk about a huge eco-tourist precinct. And it's very creative, it's innovative. But we are throwing out a very valuable ecosystem. And Aaron, I like your bio metaphor. Because actually, nature is the most creative and innovative, and we would be silly to destroy it just to create a man-made ecosystem. So that's one example. Perhaps panelists might respond to this.
And there's one gentleman there.
Yeah, Cho Kong from Shell. In a way, my question follows on from Gay Min's question. My question is really to you, Aaron. And at the risk of sounding retrograde, I'd like to ask you how you see the relationship, particularly as it applies to Singapore, between creativity and discipline. Before you can look outside the box, you must first understand about the space inside the box. It's a solution you want inside the box. Before you can break the rules, you must first understand what the rules are. If you want to extend the boundary, surely you need to know how you got to the boundary in the first place. And there are plenty of examples I can give, but I won't go into them. So how do you see that connection between creativity and not just discipline, but understanding, a deep understanding of where we are and how we've got to where we are?
Prof. Koh had a question.
Yeah, Prof. Koh.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I want to begin by saying I'm so pleased to see someone I admire very much, Lee Xue Ing, chairing this panel. You did a good job in Hong Kong, and welcome back to Singapore.
Thank you.
I have a question for Jeremy. Jeremy, I like very much your attempt to develop a uniquely Singapore Development Index. And most of the trends are positive, except for two. You know? So my question to you is, do you have any thoughts on how we can improve our performance in those two areas? Yeah. Amanda, you are brilliant, eloquent, and so good-hearted. I wish I had a daughter like you.
Thank you.
But you broke my heart. You broke my heart this morning. Yeah, and I want to tell you why you broke my heart. You seem to think that our ambition to become a global city was motivated by our wish to attract talented or wealthy people to Singapore. And you fear that we may open our door to the world, but close the door on ourselves. I want to say, as somebody who was involved in this project, that our only ambition is to create new opportunities for Singaporeans. You know, no way will we close our door on ourselves. Our one and only purpose is to benefit Singapore and Singaporeans. And your comments on the arts broke my heart even more. Because I must confess that I was the first chairman of the Arts Council, second chairman of the Heritage Board. I was part of the team that built the Esplanade and the National Gallery. And I want to say to you that in the last 25 years, I've worked so hard to make the arts blossom in Singapore. And it was never my intention or those of my colleagues to use the arts as an instrument to attract foreign talent to Singapore. Our ambition was that in addition to economic progress, we will build a Singapore in which Singaporeans will be cultured and culture living. Thank you.
I think I will first ask Amanda to talk about how she broke Prof. Koh's heart.
Yes, I really do think that I do have to explain to Prof. Koh where I was coming from in my speech. I absolutely recognize the wonderful efforts of the National Arts Council and of all the organizations in Singapore to promote the role of the arts. And I am one of a great beneficiary of the National Arts Council's efforts. I've been through many of their programs. But I just felt that such as the Mentor Access program, which linked me up with a senior writer. My book was partially funded by National Arts Council funding, and the government's role in the arts is absolutely indispensable. But where I was coming from in making these remarks was really, I suppose I had 15 minutes, and I was just trying to advance a certain view of of how important it is, really, the imperative to ensure that the arts are created for ourselves, because even with the best intentions of all these wonderful people who have been in government organizations shaping the role of the arts, I felt that I had to represent the voices of what people in the artistic community do believe to a certain degree. And to me, I think this dialogue of what the arts community's impressions are versus what the art administrators' motivations are is vital for us to move the art scene forward. And I'm very, very pleased that Professor Koh stood up and really explained exactly where he was coming from, and his colleagues were coming from in modeling Singapore as a global city. And it's something that I do deeply respect. And I think that this sort of sentiment has to be, in a way, communicated to the arts community in a way that they may be convinced by it, and because it is a reality that there are members of the arts community who bristle at certain policy decisions or level of control, but it's all about a balance, and I am hopeful that as we develop this balance, we'll be able to be better and satisfying to the arts community. So I am sorry for those remarks, but at the same time, I am coming at a place of dialogue and development.
Amanda, do you also want to just address quickly the question about heritage?
Yes, and also to address the question about heritage, I think we can be at least coming from a young person who's in the arts community, the arts community loves Singapore's heritage. There are so many poems about nostalgia of places that have been destroyed. And in fact, many of my contemporaries are writing books which are examining Singapore's history. And in my own, just as a young Singaporean, I think that this understanding of history is so important as we go forward, as we figure out, as I was talking about resolving our crisis of story, new directions in the Singapore story. This has to be informed necessarily by what what the pioneer generation did, what is the legacy of our forefathers. And I don't think that is something that we will abandon, and I think everybody on this panel, the young people, will agree with me on this. And just to segue into the point about that was earlier made about patriotism and nationalism, and whether young people are patriotic. I would say that I am really deeply patriotic. I care a lot about Singapore. Why is there the impression that young people are not patriotic? One of the reasons I want to advance is perhaps because our version of patriotism is rather narrow. Loving your country doesn't mean subscribing to just one particular view of the future of your country or one particular view of the history of your country or where it came from. I think that's part of what I was arguing when I was giving my speech, that we need, in order to forge a direction for Singapore going forward, we need to understand that there are many readings of what our development story, there are many readings of where we could go in the future, and we need to recognize all of these as coming from people who love Singapore and want the best for Singapore going into the future. And I think I would also highlight something very encouraging from what the First Lady commented, was that her children are in the School of the Arts. And she was talking about how it would be, she considered it quite difficult whether they would go into arts-related jobs in the future. But when I was in school, there wasn't even a school of the arts. And I think this is how far we have come as a country, that we've set up a school of the arts, that all these performance spaces that didn't exist when I was growing up in school. And of course, all of these things are attributable to the efforts of the government, of people like Professor Tommy Koh. And so we come back one circle, and I really do appreciate these efforts, Professor Koh.
So I think first I want to address the question about patriotism, nationalism, and what it means for globalization. And I think that this parallels the efforts to preserve heritage in Singapore, as well as to foster a civic spirit. And so over time, Singapore has grown in patriotism and nationalism. It depends on who you're defining. One man's patriot is another man's nationalist. I think the question is it necessarily have come at the exclusion of globalization? And the answer is no. And the reason why is that, do we see globalization as a zero-sum game or as a game that is win-win? And those definitions, that metaphor is key to allowing a country to be both patriotic as well as enabling it to not only be a guardian of the global system, but also to be an advocate of it. The second question was very much about what does it really take to improve the index and understand the trends. I think that during the research and also my work with local communities, I think there are two segments that are of note. I think the first, as I mentioned, was the forgotten, or I've written about, I call them the trust knots. And this is a group of people where there are multiple entrenched beliefs about whether Singapore is truly meritocratic, about whether it truly has integrity, about whether it truly has a future. And these issues are actually highly correlated, and often not only within the same person, but within the same family and the same social network. And so that rhymes very well with my work in the social sector, where we understand that socioeconomic issues, for example, are highly correlated, where failure to achieve educational outcomes is correlated with poor family outcomes, which is correlated with poor financial outcomes. And so understanding that these clusters exist and taking what I call a whole body approach, not only a whole body of the individual across multiple beliefs and multiple issues, but what I also call the whole family approach. What does it take for the whole family to be taken across the finish line? Because many policies today are what I call whack-a-mole policies, where if someone comes in for an issue for dialysis, that's one issue, but we don't know how that correlates and is connected to a spread of other issues. And this is also similar for socioeconomic belief. The second category that is also important, especially around progress and prosperity and happiness and the downward trend, I think there is that that belief is seeping from the group of trust knots into the broader middle class. And that is something that has to be addressed, not because of political opportunities or needs and so forth, but because as a country, we have to address all of those issues and for every Singaporean. And so a huge part about it is that when you build a policy that's about increasing GDP, you tend to do that about GDP, but you forget about what people are seeing on the ground. And so much is lost in translation. So much is lost about the understanding of what a GDP policy is supposed to do for their personal lives. And so it's not just a matter of the right policies, but also the right communication of the policies, not just as posters, but actual people advocating on the ground.
Okay, time is running out, but I will ask Aaron to quickly weigh in, especially on the question about the relationship between creativity and dissidence.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, a lot of the questions made me think of my English Lit A-level tutor, who once told us in a fit of slight irritation that we shouldn't only have the courage of our convictions, but also the courage of our contradictions. Now, that's a wonderful phrase when you think about it, right? To recognize that life is characterized by polarity and tension. And I want to use that as an overall theme to address a few of the questions. Because the question about SOTA, for instance, and why is it only restricted to some art forms but not others? Or even national service, right? How come some boys don't come out more patriotic? I think there's a tension between the highest purpose of what these institutions are meant to achieve and what is sometimes the gritty, untidy reality of their implementation. And we are all works in progress, as Prof. Wang mentioned earlier. And I think we need to allow for the fact that there can be improvement over time and not assume that the imperfections today somehow must translate to the system being structurally and institutionally incomplete. So I think there are many examples, for instance, of people who have enjoyed SOTA, who have also found that the disciplinary grounding that they receive from history, geography, and literature is useful for the arts education that they're getting. And in the case of national service, people who do find a great amount of meaning in the process and don't just feel that they're rushing to wait and waiting to rush. Although both of those are important parts of the overall reality. Another tension that I think we sometimes face, and this is in response to Min, your question, about Mandai and about natural heritage or built heritage in particular, is that actually often the best innovation happens in the interstices or spaces in between existing things. So between history and the present, between development and the natural environment. We need both of those to keep taking place because the constraints actually are what allow for creativity to happen. In the case of Mandai, for instance, I'm quite struck by the media coverage of it. And you notice that it's actually development that's happening on land that was already in use or impacted land, that they are trying to build a system whereby more people will appreciate the nature that's already there and bring it to a new generation of Singaporeans, and that where they move near the nature reserves, it's actually quite low intensity activity and not lots and lots of tourists simply moving in and around that area. So I think there can be nuance and we can avoid an overly binary approach to both this example and other examples of built heritage and how we're trying to balance that with the overall development that's in place. Finally, Cho, your question about discipline. Again, there I think we need to have the courage of the contradictions that life is characterized by. I don't think of discipline and creativity as somehow different. They are flip sides of the same coin. Discipline can be wonderfully generative sometimes. And one of my favorite books is actually a book by a chap called Mason Curry, and it's titled Daily Routines. And it looks at the routines of highly creative and productive people. And nearly all of them have an extremely disciplined process of waking up really early, writing a certain amount in the day, or perfecting their art form in the day, resting, working at it again, and then building up the discipline from there. I thought I'd end with a quick story on this front about how discipline can actually be very powerful. In part of my interfaith dialogue work, I made friends with a musician, monk, priest, who lives in a Benedictine community in California. And I've gone to visit him a couple of times. And what's been really striking about life in the monastery is it is so deeply disciplined because they pray at a certain time, they eat at certain times, they observe silence at other times. But within that structure, there is so much opportunity and generativity for creativity. They write, they create things, they make food, they sell things to the surrounding community, they minister, and they contribute pastoral care to the community around them. That, I think, is the kind of very generative quality that can exist when we allow creativity and discipline to complement each other and not adopt an overly binary approach. I'm happy to chat more about this over lunch if anybody wants to as well.
Okay, thank you. So with that, I think our time has long been up. Thank you so much. If we can thank the three speakers. Thank you.